Secretary Chuck Hagel, Dr. Kurt Campbell, ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to welcome all of you to the third annual Trans-Pacific Dialogue, or TPD. Since 2021, TPD has established itself as an exemplary Track 1.5 platform. I'm particularly proud that last year's special session on Korea-Japan cooperation served as a precursor to groundbreaking rapprochement between Korea and Japan. The initial Korea-Japan summit in March and the historic Camp David trilateral summit last August successfully put an end to the vicious cycle that has plagued Korea-Japan relations for decades. Against such backdrop, I would like to highlight Chairman Choi Tae-won's proposal yesterday, calling for an economic coalition between Japan and Korea. The Choi Institute plans to form a study group on its feasibility so that we could provide an initial report with various options that could be highlighted in next year's TPD. Ladies and gentlemen, when it comes to the global security landscape, we find ourselves besieged simultaneously by unprecedented crises and potential threats, which entail a more prompt and consolidated response as well as heightened vigilance. Such international crises have pushed the United States and its allies to a unique predicament. First, the United States can no longer handle these major conflicts by itself alone, especially in case of some simultaneous outbreaks. Second, scientific innovation has transformed the nature of modern warfare and conflict spectrum. The role of the Starlink in the Ukraine war epitomizes a major facet of today's advanced technologies, including dual-use technologies that were developed by the private sector and used extensively in the ongoing Ukraine war. The Israeli-Hamas conflict in Gaza also highlights the use of dual-use technologies in intensive conflict. Hence, the warfare today is more complicated and unpredictable. Ladies and gentlemen, for this year's TPD conference, members of our TPD advisory group engaged in in-depth discussion and came up with a set of agenda as reflected in your program book on your table. I would like to express my sincere gratitude to Secretary Chuck Hagel for chairing the advisory group last July. Taking this opportunity, I'd like to draw your special attention to the North Korean nuclear provocation. I'm extremely discouraged by the fact that we have fumbled every opportunity to suffocate North Korea's nuclear ambitions during the last 3 decades. All diplomatic démarches since early 1990s, ranging from bilateral, trilateral, and from parties, and even hexalateral, including 6-party talks, have completely failed. In particular, I would like to remind you that next year will mark the 30th anniversary of 1994 Geneva Agreement. Today, we have many experts here this morning, members of so-called North Korean nuclear club, who have been directly involved in negotiation with North Korea. Unfortunately, we gather here to celebrate our abortive efforts. This has led to growing frustrations and despair on the part of the Korean people. According to the Choi Institute Gallup Korea poll result last December, 76% of Koreans expressed support for Korea's indigenous development of nuclear weapons. Trump's potential re-election has added a sense of unpredictability to the future security landscape of Korean Peninsula. In a 2016 interview with the New York Times, Trump said that he would be open to allowing Japan and Korea to build their own nuclear arsenals rather than depend on American nuclear umbrella. He also said he would be willing to withdraw US forces from both Korea and Japan. While Trump disavowed some of his earlier remarks, Trump trauma persists in the minds of many Koreans and indeed many allies in Asia. Ladies and gentlemen, this year is a very special year because we are celebrating the 70th anniversary of US-Korea Broad Alliance. However, looking into the future, the US-Korea alliance must evolve to a more mutually beneficial alliance that is befitting the next 70 years. Korea's remarkable transformation into a global leader in cutting-edge technologies provides a golden opportunity to revolutionize the nature of US-Korea alliance from a conventional military alliance to a modern high-tech alliance built on scientific innovation. Off the top of my head, I would like to suggest 3 items that I think are exemplary case of such a renewed alliance. First, I would like to suggest the creation of a US-Korea bilateral or US-Korea-Japan trilateral consortium to supply enriched uranium to 450 civil nuclear power plants around the world. The current enriched uranium market is dominated by Russia's Rosatom with 46% and China with 10 to 15% of the world market share. This has led to growing concerns about the Russian and the Chinese oligopoly of the commercial enriched uranium supply chain. Even the United States today is importing 22% of the enriched uranium from Russia. This poses a grave threat to sustainable global nuclear energy security in case of supply chain choke point in this item. Second, I believe the time is ripe for the United States and Korea to actively explore mutually beneficial cooperation, especially through a US-Korea consortium for naval shipbuilding, including nuclear-powered submarine, and other defense-related productions involving cutting-edge technologies. Since the introduction of U.S. Jones Act in 1920, the prices of naval shipbuilding have skyrocketed. Moreover, the United States cannot match China's breathtaking speed in the shipbuilding industry. This consortium will utilize Korea's unparalleled comparative advantage in terms of top-class experience with the world's largest docks and experienced maritime workforce. Lastly, the United States, Korea, and Japan should consider upgrading the level of interoperability in utilizing emerging space technologies. For Korea, enhancing real-time surveillance via space-related asset is crucial for detecting major activities in North Korean nuclear arsenals and facilities, and identifying and tracking North Korean transporter electric launchers or TEL. Korea is planning to launch military reconnaissance low Earth orbit satellite with SpaceX by 2026, and 44 small satellite constellations by 2030. At the same time, Korea is preparing to build its own space-based navigation system by 2035, the so-called Korea Positioning System, or KPS, that will work closely with the existing US GPS network. On top of that, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, or ISR cooperation between Korea and the United States can definitely weaken North Korea's ability to launch surprise missile attack. Such enhanced capabilities will contribute significantly to countering North Korea's growing nuclear threats and eventually make North Korea's nuclear arsenal obsolete. Ladies and gentlemen, I look forward to constructive dialogue and intellectual engagement over the next 2 days as we journey through a dark tunnel with no visible end. I hope the TPD process will serve as a beacon of light to guide us to more durable peace and co-prosperity in the new Trans-Pacific era. I thank you.
Good evening, everyone. After a full day of stimulating conversations all afternoon, we have now the almost impossible task of standing between a crowd who has sort of heard wonderful ideas and statements all day, hungry, and those from Korea and Japan very jet-lagged, but before your dinner, we have a fireside chat. And despite the fact that this hotel has lovely fireplaces outside, we are here in this stage. But we do have lovely conversation friends with us today. You let us, we know everybody, each other, but let us just say, on my left, we have Mr. Edwin Fulner, who is the founder of the Heritage Foundation. And to his left, we have the esteemed MC that you just heard, Professor Mearsheimer from the University of Chicago. He is our model MC of the TPD. And although we can't see him virtually in this room, we have Dr. John Hamre with us on Zoom. He will be with us in audio. I'm sure his heart is with us, but his video will not be with us, but his audio. So let us proceed. The fireside chat is usually, in a fireside chat, is a very leisurely conversation. But because we are in a situation where everyone is jet-lagged and waiting for dinner, we're going to start right off into our topic. The title that we have been given is Major Simultaneous Challenges to U.S. Foreign Policy. So it's sort of a culmination of what we've been talking about all day and maybe leading into conversations about North Korea and other regional conflicts tomorrow. But we do have the three experts that we just introduced today talking about these challenges. And while we have, and so this question will be dealt with like an onion. We'll be peeling a sector off of each question. And at the end, I think, we will reach an answer to this question. So today, so far, all day, and because we come from the Asia region, we have been talking about Taiwan and North Korea. But as we know, at the present moment, the conflicts that the U.S., that is actually in progress at the moment for the U.S. foreign policy is Ukraine and the Gaza region. So let's start off with those two conflicts at the moment. I don't think Mr. Hamre is ready yet, but so we'll start with Ed. How do you think the U.S. is handling those two conflicts that are going on right now?
It's a great challenge, frankly, for both the politicians and also for U.S. capabilities. My good friend John Hamre and I were talking just the last couple days about the problems with the so-called military-industrial complex and the delivery of weapons. And I don't know if John can hear me, so I'll steal one of his lines. He said that, for example, right now, the Stinger missiles that the U.S. is shipping to Ukraine for their use, they can't be reproduced in short time because all the chips that go into those Stinger missiles are like 2 generations old, and so the whole Stinger missile has to be totally redesigned with current technology. And he says it's going to be some time. And this coming from John Hamre, the former Deputy Secretary of Defense who knows these things, that's kind of a frightening bit. In terms of the political will, I think both President Biden, certainly, and the overwhelming majority, both sides of the aisle in both the House and the Senate, in terms of supporting Israel, in the Middle East situation is very clear, but it's very interesting to me that there is a increasing skepticism about significant renewed U.S. support for Ukraine. I personally regret this because I think it's very important that the U.S. remain committed to that, and I'm frankly very, very glad that our president has expressed that view. And so it's a very mixed bag right now.
John?
Before I directly answer the question, I just wanted to make an observation. This is the third year that we've met here. And in 2021, there was no Ukraine crisis, certainly no Gaza crisis. And if you had said in 2021, when we were focusing mainly on East Asia, that next year there was going to be a major war in Ukraine, nobody would have believed it. And then last year when we were here in 2022, if you said a year from now when we meet, not only is the war in Ukraine going to be going on, but there is a war in Gaza going on as well. Nobody would have believed that either. That makes one wonder what's going to happen when we come here in 2024. Now, the question is, how well is the United States handling the two major crises that it's deeply involved in, one being Ukraine and the other being Gaza? I would answer that it's handling both of them poorly and that the United States is in really deep trouble. With regard to Ukraine, 2022 was a very good year for the Ukrainians and for the Americans. The Ukrainians won two big tactical victories at Kharkiv and Kherson, and the Russians were very slow to mobilize. And at the end of 2022, it looked like the Ukrainians were going to win the war. And you want to remember that General Milley said at the time, this is in the fall of 2022, that now's the time to settle this conflict because this is the high water mark for the Ukrainians. The Biden administration and most of the people in the American foreign policy elite said, no, 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 no. The Ukrainians are doing really very well. So we doubled down, and then in 2023, the Russians turned the tide, and the Russians have been on the march since then. And the Russians, in my opinion, are going to win the war. This is a war of attrition, and in a war of attrition, what matters is the manpower on each side and the amount of artillery, to include tubes and shells, on both sides. In my estimation, the Russians have a 5-to-1 advantage in manpower, and they have somewhere between a 5-to-1 and 10-to-1 and growing advantage in artillery. And if you look at the casualty exchange ratios, despite the conventional wisdom in the West, the casualty exchange ratios favor the Russians. And when the casualty exchange ratios favor the Russians, and the Russians have 5 soldiers for every 1 Ukrainian soldier, I can tell you who's going to win that war, and it's going to be the Russians. And all you have to do is read the newspapers these days closely to see how much trouble the Ukrainians are in. And of course, the United States is deeply committed to this conflict. We've argued on numerous occasions that if we don't win, that it will be a hammer blow to American prestige around the world, and furthermore, it'll be a hammer blow to NATO. The Russians are going to win. They're not going to decisively defeat Ukraine, but they're going to end up conquering more territory than they already now control. And Ukraine's going to be turned into a dysfunctional rump state, not going to be able to join NATO, not going to be able to join the EU. And this is going to be a huge black eye for the United States. With regard to the Middle East, of course, we're joined at the hip with the Israelis, as we long have been, and they're now involved in a fight in Gaza. And the $64,000 question is whether or not you think the Israelis can defeat Hamas and win this war in some meaningful way, and then once they win it, come up with a diplomatic solution or a political solution that turns Gaza into a rather peaceful place inside of Greater Israel. In my opinion, the Israelis are not going to defeat Hamas. They're not going to go in and root them out. and kill every last one of them, because the cost would be enormous for the Israeli military, and the Israeli military, the IDF, is cost sensitive. So that's not going to happen. But if I'm wrong and they root out Hamas, there'll just be another terrorist group that, or resistance group, whatever you want to call it, that pops up in its place. You want to remember that there were not just Hamas fighters who went into Israel on October 7th. There were 11 different resistance groups, 11 different resistance groups, Hamas and Islamic Jihad being the most prominent. There's no military solution to this conflict. The idea that you're going to beat the hell out of the Palestinians and they're eventually going to submit to an occupation, not going to happen. The Israelis have been at this for a long, long time, trying to employ Zeev Jabotinsky's Iron Wall. It doesn't work. Military force just doesn't solve the problem. And by the way, you want to remember that inside the borders of Greater Israel, and that's what we're talking about here, Greater Israel includes the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and Green Line Israel. That's Israel before the 1967 war. Inside Greater Israel, there's 7.3 million Israeli Jews and 7.3 million Palestinians. That basically says you have rough equality in the two populations. And if you look at birth rates moving forward, the Palestinians have a slight advantage moving forward. So the problem that the Israelis face is they have this huge number of Palestinians in their midst, and it creates all sorts of problems. And you get things like the Intifada, the first Intifada in 1987, the second Intifada in late 2000, and now you have what happened on October 7th. This is going to continue for the foreseeable future unless the Palestinians get some sort of state of their own. They're not going to get a state of their own. The Israelis are going to try and beat them into submission, which is what they're doing now. And in my opinion, it's not going to work. This is going to have disastrous consequences for the administration. I can't believe that people inside the White House don't fully understand this. And that's why they're trying to shut it down, trying to figure out a way to solve the problem once the shooting stops. But if you listen to the Americans talk and you listen to the Israelis talk, it's quite obvious that we're playing according to two different playbooks. And this one is not going to be shut down. So what you want to think about when you think about the United States moving forward, and this is especially true for our Asian allies in the audience, is that the United States, instead of pivoting fully to Asia and focusing laser-like on China, which is the principal threat to the United States, because China is a peer competitor, we are instead bogged down in a war in Eastern Europe that we're going to lose, right? And we are bogged down in a war in Gaza where there is no solution. The Israelis are not going to lose in the sense they're going to be militarily defeated. That's not going to happen. But they're not going to win in any meaningful sense. And it's going to be one giant mess for the foreseeable future. And Uncle Sam will be deeply involved in that one giant mess. And all of this is to say, I think the United States is in serious trouble today.
On that omnibus note, John, are you here?
Hear me?
Yes. Oh, good.
Oh, okay.
Welcome.
Okay, good.
So have you
Well-
been able to hear what?
Yeah, yes, I wasn't. I've heard enough, I think, to understand the thrust that both Ed and Dr. Mearsheimer have offered. Let me just say, I think the administration has done a good job for both the Ukraine and Gaza wars tactically, but not strategically. I don't think that the administration has really articulated strategic goals. Our position in both instances will help them win, but that doesn't constitute a strategic framework. And I think it's easier to contemplate a strategic framework for Ukraine. I think it's very obvious that we need to bring Ukraine into NATO right away. And I think as soon as we do that, I think it's going to bring the war really to an end. There's some risk to it, of course, but I don't personally think that risk is overwhelming. The benefits are enormous if we were to do that. It's much harder, of course, in Gaza because, as Dr. Mearsheimer pointed out, Israel has to make a profound change in the middle of its grieving over the hideous attack that they experienced. And it will take, we have to find a legitimate political leader. In the meantime, the international community has to step in to create a government that can function until new leadership grows. We'll have to develop a constabulary that will provide security for Palestinians in the absence of a government for some time. This will take, a very long time. So there's no question it's challenging, but I think it's much easier to contemplate a solution in Ukraine.
So the strategic dilemma that John Hamre is describing, do you agree?
Alas, I do, and you compound that with the subjects we have talked about already today and that we will be talking about tomorrow, particularly with the threat from North Korea to the ROK, with the threat from China to Taiwan that we talked about in great detail. Speaking of somebody who's being stretched very thin, even thinner than we are now, both in terms of our long-term vision, and I think all three of us would agree that strategically, the thing we have to stay focused on has got to be China and the U.S. PRC relationship, and we're not able to do that right now. And so let me just, I'm the conservative. I'm supposed to be the pessimist. But let me be a little bit more optimistic and say, hey, all my friends here who are in the White House or in the administration, make sure that you invite the Prime Minister of Japan and the President of Korea to the 75th anniversary of NATO summit, which is going to be held in Washington next July. A big deal. Let's reaffirm this kind of special evolving relationship that we see that's coming up, and let's be look very positively in that direction. And in the meantime, some of the other challenges that came up today, how do we mobilize small, medium enterprise in the United States and elsewhere among our allies with technology and get it into the system? Just Saturday in Politico, a journal that everybody in Washington kind of has to read, there was a leaked copy of a new Pentagon study coming out on how capable we are in terms of those kinds of issues, the issues that were talked about today of technology and how you translate it into keeping us at the cutting edge and meeting what the Chinese have been doing so effectively for so many years. And the bottom line was, hey, the bureaucracy has not been doing what it should be doing in terms of making it happen within the Pentagon. Hey, this is a real challenge. And then immediately somebody from the outside says, well, from what I read about this new report coming out, there are not enough specifics there in terms of how we redo it, how we re-encourage positive action. So the challenges that we face in both the military arena and the overall general public, the overall general diplomatic relationships around the world are really pretty overwhelming.
Yes. I will get to you, but when you answer, could you also, we're also talking about the fact that the strategic importance of the United States is still should be on China and North Korea, but right now, as John talked about, you pointed out they're sort of bogged down in the two wars that are not going well for the United States. What kind of signal does that send to China and North Korea, who, as you say, should be of more importance to the United States?
Yeah, there are a lot of people who think that this sends a bad signal to the Chinese from an American point of view, and they may take advantage of us and invade Taiwan or do something in the South China Sea or the East China Sea to take advantage of us because we are pinned down. I don't think that's going to happen. I think the problem that we face is that this is the Americans, given these two crises in Gaza and in Ukraine, is we cannot fully pivot to East Asia, right? And if you listen to people talk today, it's quite clear that there are a lot of problems that the deterrence structure, the Western-led or the American-led deterrence structure has in East Asia that need to be resolved. But it's hard to resolve them when you're bogged down in two other conflicts, right? That means it's in China's interest to make the Ukraine war go on forever and ever. A lot of people will say the Chinese have a vested interest in seeing the Russians win in Ukraine. I think that's wrong. The Chinese have a vested interest in seeing the Russians and the Ukrainians, with the Americans by their side, slugging it out forever and ever, because that makes it very difficult to pivot fully to East Asia. Furthermore, another huge problem that flows from the Ukraine war is that we have driven the Russians into the arms of the Chinese. If you're in a multipolar system, there are three great powers. You're number one, and number two is China, and it's a peer competitor. You want to make sure that number three is on your side of the ledger, not on number two's side of the ledger. As a result of the war in Ukraine, we have driven the Russians into the arms of the Chinese. If you go back to World War II, this is like fighting Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin at the same time. You go to war against Adolf Hitler, you want Joe Stalin on your side. You might not like him, but this is basic balance of power politics 101. So it's very difficult for us to pivot fully. And furthermore, we've driven the Russians into the arms of the Chinese. Now, I don't think that the Chinese are looking for an opportunity to take advantage of us. But if a crisis breaks out in the South China Sea or over Taiwan, we will not be as well off as we would have been if we had fully pivoted to Asia to deal with the principal threat to the United States.
Could I jump in here? I just really don't think that's right. Beijing and Moscow joined the Shanghai Cooperation Organization 25 years ago. I don't think we drove the Russians into the arms of the Chinese at all. I think the Russians have done a great disservice to themselves. They've weakened themselves dramatically, and they've given a great gift to the Chinese. I think the Russians come out of this war weaker, China comes out stronger. That's a very real reality. But I also don't agree at all that we're in a mess in Asia. Look, we've got two powerful allies that have come closer together during the last 2 years. Their economies are going to be booming really shortly domestically. Internationally, they're on the move throughout Asia. And I hear that from everybody. At the same time, we've been able to build a network across Asia, which is going to be more resilient over time than NATO. So I just don't agree with your assessment at all.
What do you say? Put you in the hot seat, yeah.
Can I be the referee?
No.
I'm trying to look for the bright side on both, but this, John, is quite right. I mean, look at the advantages China has from what it has done in terms of getting closer to Russia, in terms of cheaper energy coming in. All the Russian oil that theoretically was going to be embargoed, well, where's it going now? We all know where it's going. So, yeah, there have been mistakes all the way along the line in terms of those kinds of things, but I want to go back to the first thing I talked about, where I've learned so much from Hamry, and that is, how do we get ourselves back in terms of keeping our focus where it should be? How do we get back to raising our technological capability in terms of specific military hardware that we're going to need, having given away so much of our backup capabilities to Ukraine, and with the continuing two wars going on already? How do we keep ourselves focused in terms of that primary rival out there in terms of China? And it's a big challenge for everybody, I think, inside the government and outside, and let's work together to make it happen.
Oh, you do sound like a peaceful referee, but
Can I?
John, yes.
Yeah. This is
Reply to Hammer.
Yeah, I just want to say, I wanted to reply to the other John. I didn't argue that we were in a mess in East Asia. My argument is that we're in deep trouble in Ukraine and we're in deep trouble in the Middle East, and that's making it difficult to pivot to East Asia. And furthermore, we have driven the Russians into the arms of the Chinese. So my argument was that we're not in a good position in East Asia, or as good a position as we should be, should a crisis break out. But I didn't mean to give the impression that it's a mess in East Asia. It's a mess in the other two places. With regard to the Russians, I respectfully disagree. I think if you go back to when Putin took over in 2000 and you look at Putin's behavior from 2000 roughly up to 2014, maybe even 2022, he was deeply interested in having good relations with the West. He did not want to jump into bed with the Chinese. And I've talked to all sorts of very high-level Russian people over time who say that the United States and Russia should be natural allies. We Russians have had historically bad relations with the Chinese, and we should be allied with you against the Chinese, or we Russians should at least be sitting on the fence. You hear that argument often, not allied with the Chinese. And I do believe, I mean, I'm not saying I have truth, but I do believe that we drove the Russians into the arms of the Chinese, and we did it through mainly NATO expansion, but more generally our effort to turn Ukraine into a Western bulwark on Russia's border.
While we're talking about East Asia and putting people in other people's arms, where's North Korea fit on? Is this situation has pushed North Korea into the arms of Russia or the other way around?
Well, as an ammunition supplier to Russia, increasing ammunition supplier to Russia, and they've always been allied, and they had their summit, of course, Putin and Kim. So they're probably as close as they ever have been, and whatever international sanctions there have been on the DPRK are basically irrelevant now, because you've got 2 of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council who are willfully violating it on a day-to-day basis. So,
yeah, I would just say very quickly, I think it's quite clear that the Iranians, the North Koreans, the Chinese, and the Russians are all working much more closely today than they were 10 years ago.
So it has become, I think, to emphasize someone else, a much more stickier relationship on that axle than it has ever been before.
Well, but I
Axis
think
of evil.
there's a deeper issue, though. I mean, North Korea has historically maneuvered between Russia and China to try to get better benefit from each. The outcome of the Ukraine war is going to be a weaker Russia, one that's going to be more dependent on China. And so, frankly, North Korea is going to lose some degrees of freedom in this regard. Now, I agree with Ed. I think that they've decided to a little bit of a way out right now to become the weapons directorate for Russia. So there's a near-term advantage that they'll have. In the longer term, I'm not so sure this is a real advantage for North Korea.
Before we get to the final question, I did want to give the audience an opportunity, if you wanted. Chungmin's, Professor Lee has his hand up even before I finish that question. Yes, Professor Lee, yeah.
My name is Chungmin Lee. I work at the Carnegie Endowment, but working from Seoul. My question is very simple. There is a possibility that Donald Trump might be a U.S. president again in November 24. Should that happen, what type of foreign policy will he pursue, and what type of an impact, positive and negative, will it have on your critical allies, i.e. the ROK and Japan? And I think there are people in this room who have deep traumas of the initial Trump administration, and they're very concerned that if Mr. Trump re-wins the White House, there will be a lot of turbulation in the alliance.
Okay, all right, we'll start with the voice of above. John, what happens in November 24 under those conditions that Changmin just outlined? What are we to expect?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think we're very fortunate to have two powerful allies in Asia. Relationship during Trump's tenure before in Asia, it was superficially scratchy, but it wasn't that bad. The real trauma will be in Europe. It will be with NATO. I think Europeans are more profoundly anxious, and Trump has this very curious, I can't understand it, affection for Vladimir Putin. So I think that the trauma is going to be far more intense in Europe than it'll be in Asia. I personally don't think it would be that bad in Asia.
Well, you may get some people from Asia that may disagree, but I think Ed wants to chime in.
I was really shocked 2 weeks ago to receive in the mail The Economist issue looking forward to 2024, where their lead editorial came out foursquare and said that the biggest danger to the world will be if Donald Trump is elected in 2024. I thought to myself, bigger than what's going on in the Middle East right now, bigger than a resurgent China invading Taiwan, et cetera. Donald Trump coming back. I mean, this is Donald Trump, who eventually ended up, after some ups and downs, speaking very specifically to our colleagues here, with a good relationship with Korea, having renegotiated the Korea-U.S. economic framework. I had a good relationship with our Japanese friends. And as John just said, yeah, there were some ups and downs in all of Asia, and some of his dalliance with the leader of the DPRK. I think he learned a lot from that. But frankly, I'm not worried about it at all. And for my friends in the room, I hope we can calm your fears and bring you back to some kind of a sense of reality. We've done a major effort in terms of outlining what a sensible conservative group of policies would be in a new administration at Heritage, my alma mater. I'm not there anymore, but it's my alma mater. And working with 80 other organizations from around the country. And, we're outlining some fairly comprehensive alternatives to what we see now, but also building on some of the positive things that the Biden administration has done, whether it was AUKUS, whether it was building up the Quad, whether it was, in fact, the Camp David Accords that were so important in Asia. So I think things are going to be good.
You don't seem to be getting a lot of positive reaction. But thank you very much, Dr. Mearsheimer, Dr. Fulner, and John Hamley up above. I hope you get well soon, John.
I do too. Thank you so much.
So thank you very much. Yes.